In this episode of INSSA Insights, we chat with Jack McKenna, the president and CEO of Prescient, a premier tech-enabled intelligence and risk advisory firm that operates at the intersection of cybersecurity, corporate security, and investigative intelligence. In the following two episodes, Jack and I discuss the shift from traditional physical risks to hybrid attacks involving cyber operations, state-backed disinformation, and data theft, providing essential strategies for NGOs to protect vulnerable beneficiaries and maintain operational integrity in a digital-first environment. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to INSSA Insights, or welcome to INSSA Insights, a podcast brought to you by the International NGO Safety and Security Association. Like the association's name suggests, the podcast focuses on issues affecting the security of international development and humanitarian aid organizations, and hopefully along the way providing useful information to help them better understand and manage the risks they face in the field. In today's episode, we are speaking with Jack McKenna, President and CEO of Prescient, a tech-enabled digital intelligence investigation and risk advisory firm at the intersection of cybersecurity, corporate security, disputes, and intelligence. Prescient supports clients around the world from offices in the United States and Europe. He is also serves on the board of District 4 Labs, which is a spin-off of Prescient that develops cutting-edge OSINT, open source information, intelligence, data products, and technologies. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Thanks for having me, Omri.
And it's great to see you in a non-work related area. I'm happy to say I was a client of Jack's in a previous time, and on more than one occasion, he pointed out things that we wish we didn't know, but obviously are glad we did. So Jack, tell us a little bit about Prescient and sort of the overall what you guys do on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. So thanks again for having me. It's great to be here. We support a number of different clients, investors, law firms, and corporates with intel and investigative services. But for the purposes of this conversation, what we're doing a lot is providing actionable protective intelligence and threat intelligence in the corporate security sector. So we say that we're at the intersection of corporate security and cybersecurity because we're seeing a lot of threats that come in from digital sources that then have physical security implications. So historically, and to this day in a lot of organizations, I see that those domains are sort of separate. So we're trying to help bridge the gap where we can and help clients protect their personnel, assets, and reputation. So some of the work that we're doing is ongoing and more proactive, and some of it is more reactive. Unfortunately, you've had the pleasure or displeasure, depending on the case, of experiencing it both ways.
So what is the current threat landscape from the online perspective, cyber perspective, that a lot of these, organizations, corporations, in our case, obviously, international development and humanitarian aid NGOs, what kind of threats are they facing, like examples that could translate into the physical world and affect them? Yeah.
The NGO and nonprofit space is it's interesting, but it's a difficult one. And I'm sure I'm not telling you or your audience anything you don't already know, but in many ways, they're the most threatened, but they're the most under-resourced. So I can't tell you how many companies we work with that have tens of millions of dollars in security spend every year, and the threat landscape in which they operate pales in comparison to the threat landscape of some of these nonprofit organizations. So, in your case, in the work that we did together, a lot of the threats and threatening chatter and doxing and things like that increasingly are not on the Facebooks of the world or the X's. They're in these newly proliferated areas of the internet, some of whom are messaging platforms or like Telegram or Discord servers, or some are these like offshoot niche social media sites, and getting access to those things is very difficult. So what I see a lot from our clients is if it's not on one of the social media platforms that like your kids use, you think it's the dark web. And the dark web is actually very different in the way that you access it. Some of these other things are widely accessible by anyone with a computer, but they're increasingly not operating in open environments where it's a closed forum or a group of some kind where you have to have a login and you have to be vetted to kind of get in there. So what our team does is we have these online personas that are well vetted, and we get into as many of these closed forms as possible, and then use technology and AI to scrape that data and make it searchable for our clients. So that's a long way of saying I think that the threat landscape it was always, expansive for organizations in the NGO sector, but the threat actors are making it increasingly difficult for the organizations and the consulting firms that work with them to, really dig into what's going on.
In an international context, how does Prescient and organizations like Prescient, how do they go in and identify, first of all, locate where those threats might be, and then identify who the individuals or threats are, are making the threats to the NGOs or the people whether it's executives there or otherwise?
Yeah, it depends on the country. Some have kind of their own go-to social media platforms or things like that, but some of those other platforms that I referenced are sort of ubiquitous around the world. A lot of it has to do with language capability. It's actually been made easier with AI, but it's also easier for threat actors to obfuscate who they are and where they're from using the same technology. So I think where AI is good, not great, is sort of in the meme culture and slang world. So in order to infiltrate, for lack of a better word, one of these closed forums or groups, you have to prove that you're a real person. But also there's industry slang and terms that if you don't use, it's going to be like a record scratch that you don't belong, or in some cases you're law enforcement or whatever. So it's just getting very difficult because you have to do it in the local language, knowing the relevant speech, to really show that you're a real person, and then using some data science and stuff to scrape the technology. So there are software companies that are doing this and can make that data available, but there's not that many that cover the far reaches of the internet, and obviously they're expensive. So NGOs may not have the budget or the resources that some of these larger organizations do. So you got to make do.
And then when you guys finally identify threats, what actions do you guys normally do? I mean, I know, again, from personal experience, I know you guys have analysts who kind of evaluate the threats. How do you initially make that initial sort of deep dive or whatever? Sort of what are your clues, or what are the things that you use to identify potential issues that they might have?
Yeah, I mean, every organization kind of has their own risk threshold. So we have some that are I don't want to hear from you unless it's a threat to life with an exact location. So threats to life are an hourly reality for them. Whereas other organizations are we shouldn't be polarizing. So if anyone's pissed off, we want to know about it really quickly. So we deal with that. And that's, again, something that would be difficult for an organization to do on their own, just using software, because you have to then build that matrix, whereas we can kind of custom build it. So that's what we do. As far as how we learn more about someone that we find, the fact that there's been so many data breaches and there's so much information out there, that's a threat to our clients, but it's also an asset for our investigators, because we're able to pull back data from decades to kind of unearth someone's online presence and kind of figure it out. So maybe the threat actor have had great operational security in the last 5 years when they've been up to no good, but they had a MySpace when they were 12 years old or whatever, and they used a poor password that it got leaked somewhere else. So you kind of have to follow the breadcrumbs, but you can't do that if you don't have access to the data, which is kind of the challenge that we were discussing earlier.
And how does that work in an international context? You mentioned the language barrier, other areas when you come across, there's been a few cases out there, and I'm going to touch on some of those a little later, but in that international context, how do you then go about if there is the language, if there is issues that that just normally don't translate to English or whatever else? How do you sort of zero in on those individuals, and then what do you do with the information?
Yeah, so the breached data is actually more important for international cases, especially attribution, because unlike in the United States, there's so much less public record data that's accessible online. So you got to use other sources. So there's been data breaches across the world, actually probably more so in other countries like government institutions, the transportation ministry of the Russian Federation, for example. It's going to have driver's licenses and all ID numbers and stuff for all sorts of different citizens. That information does not exist anywhere else. So that affects U.S. citizens too. But sometimes that you could put it in the dark web category because it came from the dark web, but in practice, it's just PII that you can use to unearth someone's online presence. So in that context, that information is more helpful overseas than it is dealing with folks in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I remember reading about Bellingcat, things like that, and how they were able to sort of unmask some of the culprits that, doing everything from, the Malaysia Airlines all the way through to the, nerve gas attack in the UK. And I'd always kind of, the ability to do that open source, and all that they do is everything is open source. So, I mean, it feels like the information is out there. It's just a question of finding it.
Yeah. And I think, the reality is for nonprofit organizations or NGOs, they're not going to be able to collect a lot of this information on their own. They're probably going to be relying on service providers or contractors or software platforms going to help them with this. I think what's important from this conversation, and I hope what people take away from it, is at least know that data is a useful source, so that when you're discussing with these partners that you're going to hopefully work with to protect yourself on the physical and the cyber side, you're asking the right questions, and you make sure that whatever your security protocols are, that they are cognizant of the risks presented by these kind of alternative sources of data.
I mentioned earlier that I was gonna touch on a few sort of public cases. The first one, and there's three that I can sort of name offhand, and that's the 2022 data breach against the ICRC, International Committee for the Red Cross, which had, I think it was over 500,000 beneficiaries or vulnerable people whose information, PII, was divulged. The other one is against the White Hats in Syria, which is the Syrian civil defense. They had a huge, disinformation campaign backed by the Russian government, I believe. That was, just, saying that they were terrorists and everything else, which I think we can all say that was definitely not the case. And then the last one is, organizations, and I won't say who they are in this case, but being in complex environments like Afghanistan or other ones, that they're able to the threat actors are able to exploit fraud, and they can use tools, whatever, to create fraud and overall corruption. How in those instances could Prescient or organizations like it, or even the IT team, if they have a cybersecurity team, how can they do, or what can they do to sort of, along with asking those right questions, what basic protocols can they tell their staff and personnel and even beneficiaries so that they can make sure that their information is safe?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, I think for any organization, but especially someone in the NGO space, if a really dedicated nation state wants to do you harm, it's very difficult to prevent that from happening from an IT protection standpoint, because they'll use exploits and vulnerabilities that may not get caught by even advanced monitoring platforms within internal IT organizations. So that's not to say don't care about it. Yeah. You should absolutely have as strong a program as you can possibly have. But if somebody wants to get access to your network, who's really determined, has that kind of resources, it's very difficult to deal with it. So I think what you can do is be cognizant of what data you are maintaining, and trying to use the kind of least privilege access principle whenever you're inputting data. So asking the organizations that you support or local governments or whatever to provide as little information as humanly possible. And then if they have to provide sensitive information, understand that it may be exposed. So in preparation for that, I think having really tight data destruction policies would be awesome, because I think in the case of the Red Cross, there was a report after the fact, I think it was by Palo Alto Networks, that suggested that the threat actors were in their network for 70 days. So they were just watching and seeing what was going on. Now, if they had inputted a bunch of sensitive information and then deleted it, even if the threat actors were watching that happen, there may not be anything for them to do about that. So just understanding where the data is, making sure you ingest as little as possible and then give access to as little as possible for your internal folks, it's going to be the best bet. And we don't have to go all into the AI stuff now, but organizations are deploying that technology, and as well they should. But you got to treat an AI agent similar to how you treat an employee. So don't give it access to things that it doesn't absolutely need to have access to. And if you do give them access to things, try to have a tight retention policy. Yeah, because then in the event of a breach or an incident, if the data is not in your environment, then you may not be as exposed.
Yeah. I've actually just been to a couple conferences talking about the convergence or alignment between the sort of cybersecurity realm and the physical in real life security realm. When we're talking about refugees or political dissidents, vulnerable groups in general who are assisted by NGOs, how does that jump from like the cyber realm to the in real life world? And so what are the cascading effects? How do if they get that information, what can they do to exploit it? Especially if you have people who they don't have a home, they don't have the a specific place, perhaps they're in a refugee camp or something like that. How can that be used to exploit them and
yeah. I mean, overseas, you've seen these NGOs be used as kind of political pawns, and they're supposed to be neutral, but when they have these attacks against them, it kind of like works against that. So I think, for a vulnerable population, a breach of their information in the environment of a Red Cross or maybe someone even, more politically charged, that could put them in danger with their local government, because it would suggest a relationship. And so I would imagine if this continues to happen, it will make it less likely that local organizations or local populations will participate in things that are being put on by these NGOs, because they worry that if it gets found out that I'm working with you or supporting you or whatever, that's tough. Now, I'm also just referring to PII because that's generally where we operate, and the subsidiary company that you referenced, District 4, is where they collect and license that information. But, we haven't talked about emails, photos, any of that kind of stuff. So, maybe like there's like a national or global nonprofit, and then they're soliciting the support of a local group. That local group may be in more danger than the national organization or the global organization. So just a connection may be a risk. So, I think it's very difficult, and it's only going to accelerate with the use of AI, because people are going to be careless with how they use it, or they're not going to take the steps that they need to take, and it'll make it easier and more destructive to do them harm.
You mentioned something specifically, that idea that local beneficiaries, implementing partners that are local. Oftentimes, I know from experience that we definitely would oftentimes not. Very low-key participation and partnerships specifically for the things that you said, especially in areas, I'm thinking like Ukraine or Syria or places like that, where, there is a lot of infiltration by the governments or anything else, and that trust has been eroded, so that people really do worry about their physical safety because of the associations they might have with a larger international NGO or things like that. Are you seeing some of that PII being used, or have you seen it being used on both sides? One, obviously to target people, which, as you said, but also the other way, like to unmask people who are perpetrators of things, that might be against refugees or things like that. I mean, are you able to backtrack it?
Absolutely. So District 4 actually has a relationship with Bellingcat for these sorts of investigations, and they license the data to nonprofits and NGOs free of charge in many cases to help them with this kind of stuff. Basically it's just anytime you sign up for an account, anytime you send your information anywhere, you got to assume that it could become publicly available someday. So basically what we see is, if we find a social media account or an email or a phone number or some identifier that we think was associated with a threat actor or a bad guy, we try to figure out, what else can we find using this identifier? So if it's the username for a social media account, there's ways to query breaches in the past to see where else that username has been used as a handle. So email, social media, whatever the case is, you just kind of keep unraveling the onion to find similarities. Passwords, a lot of times that they're encrypted, but they can be cracked. And so then in a lot of these breaches, there's plain text passwords. And so whereas for you and I, it's best practice to use a unique password. Strangely, in this situation, it makes it easier to unmask someone if their password is really unique, because then if you find it's used on some other account that's been breached, it's a high degree of likelihood that it's the real person. So there's countless examples of threat actors that have been anonymous or hackers, and the use of this breach data and these breadcrumbs have been used to locate them, and in some cases arrest them or target them with law enforcement activity or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. In your work or in Prescient's work.
Thank you to the Robert McPherson Fellowship for its generous support and donation, helping to make these podcasts possible.